important thinkers, not really about Andalusian Zāhirism, but really just, people who may or may not be Zāhiri, except for Ibn Hazm, of course, but had something to say about grammar. I use the term grammar and philology. I kind of mean the type of philology that's practiced by, many different cultures around the world, in which they attempt to understand key texts in their tradition. So we see that, whether it's, in Europe with Latin, Greek around the Mediterranean, in China, in India with Sanskrit and the like. I tried not to use the word linguistics because it's really a post-Enlightenment coinage, but if I slip up, forgive me. So one thing to discuss before we go too far is that when we say Zahirism, even though I'm not talking about the hermeneutic side of it, but when we say Zahirism, we really mean something that is closer to textualism than literalism. I don't want to go too much in detail about what that exactly means, but literalism is a method of hermeneutic interpretation that depends on the kind of the meaning of the text as given, if you like, by dictionaries and by formal methods, whereas textualists look at the communicative side of what the text is doing. So for a Zahiri, a lot of the time the slander is that they're being literal, but the truth is that Ibn Hazm's method is really, what is the first thing a native speaker would think upon hearing this? And he accepts, majaz or kind of figurative speech as long as the text leads you to that. He doesn't like linguistic gymnastics where you just decide to find some kind of alternate, meaning for a text. At the base of it, the basic difference between Mu'tazilism and Zahirism is that Mu'tazilism, from an epistemological point of view, has confidence in human reason and that it can access something that we can call a'illah. And then this allows, with obviously certain conditions, us to interpolate and less often to extrapolate. And that is the legal basis, but it also has implications in terms of the grammatical side of it as well. On the other side, Zahirism denies this, and data becomes preeminent. For the Mu'tazili, the revealed text is a map from which we can, construct other things. It's got some essence in which we can go somewhere else. For Zahirism, the text is complete, because if God wanted to say something else to us, He would have. And if He were to speak to us in ways that we couldn't understand, then that's a type of deception. Whereas Mu'tazilism, the Mu'tazili see the text as being amenable to kind of deeper understanding. So, as for Ibn Hazm's, now Ibn Hazm is obviously, he is Andalusian Zāhirism, there's no doubt. However, he's not a grammarian, even though language plays a very important part of his method, and there are some texts on this, but there's really a lot more to say than has been published so far. In terms of actual study of philology, I've put up the quote there, which essentially summarizes his attitude. And for him, ilm al-naḥw is prattle, and it's there's no benefit in it, and it really just kind of distracts you from what is more important. So his critique really is that the epistemological foundations of the philological sciences, they are weak, and therefore their knowledge is speculative. To him, that is equivalent to a lie, and that deep study of philology is a distraction from the true purpose of a scholar, which is a deep study of revealed texts. Ibn Hazm does not give any sustained critique of, like a detailed critique of the grammarians. He doesn't cite them and respond to them. It's kind of just like a transcendental critique of grammar, and he recommends some very basic texts like Al-Wadih of Al-Zubaydi, who was an Andalusian scholar. And if you were to read this grammar text, it's very amazing because he really doesn't, he just describes, if you wanted to say this, you would say this. If you wanted to say this, you'd do that. It's very, very straightforward and has a very kind of easy pedagogical method compared to the later texts, which are kind of quite puzzling for many students and teachers. Now, under the sway of Zahirism, maybe, is Ibn Mada al-Qurtubi. He was spent most of his time in the Almohad or Al-Muwahhid Empire that was in North Africa and Andalus. And he has a book which we now know by the title Raddu ala al-Nuha, the response to the grammarians. There is lots of discussion about this title. It's certainly not the title of his book. He has we know he has two other books, but this is the title that has been found on at least one manuscript. So that's the title that people refer to the book as. Now, the book has been read to show how Ibn Mada doesn't like certain grammatical tools. But if we read it in a different way, we can see that Ibn Mada's real problem is that the theoretical structure is in this whole science of Nahw and Sarf that has been created by the grammarians leads to untruths in the text of the Quran. Because there are certain excesses that the grammatical governors, such as the Amil, and different types of reconstructions that are required, that mean that the Quran is somehow deficient or not clear. Ibn Mada says this is not possible, and he does something that is really quite creative. He says then, if that's the case, this theoretical structure is posited by the grammarians, but it is speculative. So it could be discarded or countered. And that's exactly what he does, but only in a very piecemeal way. For him, he is also under the influence of Al-Muhaddism, which is a particular type of thinking that kind of tries to keep away from dhann. And you can see from this quote how he is really preoccupied with epistemological concerns. Where he's saying here, if you were to take grammar and you were to exchange those suppositions of dhunun, and then this is very interesting because now he's looking at different types of dhunun. For him, a fiqhi dhann is one that is, the one that we are given by the lawgiver, and then we have some certainty to what it might be because it's coming from a source that we can trust. It's a divine source. The second one is medicine, which we can, substitute nowadays somewhat anachronistically for like the natural sciences that can be verified empirically. Whereas something like grammar cannot be verified, or rather the theoretical structure cannot be verified empirically, and therefore it can be thrown out the window. So now coming to Abu Hayyan, he was born just outside of Granada. He received an extensive training in Al-Andalus. He probably had completed most of his scholarly training before he left. He read the Quran in many different qira'at multiple times. He had studied the Kashaf of Az-Zamakhshari, and he had studied Maliki fiqh, theology. He was able to write poetry and do many other things. And then in 679, he left Al-Andalus for a couple of reasons. Went to Hajj and then settled in Egypt and went around Egypt up and down, and then died in Cairo. There are rhetorical clues to immediately to his this binary that he creates, if you like, between Mashriqis who are either Mu'tazili or are under the sway of Mu'tazili thinking, and those Maghribis who he sees are not. So even in the introduction to the Bahr, he says the best texts of grammar are Sibawayh, the founder of that science, but also, under the heavy sway of, the Basran milieu. And then on the other side, he puts two Andalusians, Ibn Asfur, who he cites as having the best text on Sarf, and Ibn Malik, who he cites as having the best text in Nahu, which is At-Tasheel. And he does the same for Tafsir. He places as Zamakhshari, who he, you can actually read Al-Bahr as a pseudo-commentary of the Kashaf, because he cites it so often. But also Ibn Atiyah is Al-Wajiz. What was right there? That's name. Muharrir Al-Wajiz. And that kind of sets it up. He also uses often in his grammatical text and his tafsir, he uses the word ashabuna, which we can translate, an Australianism, our mates. And he uses it variously for Basrans and Andalusians, which is very interesting. Just to continue that point, he also refers to Ibn Hajib's grammatical text Al-Kafiyah as the grammar of the jurists. And also another a grammarian who lived in his time, Ibn Iyaz, he called him Abu Ta'alil. Here it doesn't literally mean the father of Ta'alil, but the someone who is, in love with or often does these kinds of grammatical explanations, and he's using it in a derogatory sense, as in he just finds something and he just makes up some kind of grammatical explanation. So the basic idea, what Abu Hayyan is basically doing, is he's retaining the basic Basran tenets of Usul al-Nahu. But what he does is he applies a data-oriented approach. So instead of having the usual Mu'tazili, if I can use that word in this sense, Mu'tazili confidence in rationalistic processes, he demotes that and instead promotes data. And you can see this in many different aspects. One of it is the copious citations of Quranic recitations, the qira'at, so much so that many qira'at that he cites, we don't really have other sources for. So he has a big kind of respect, such that a Quranic, such that a qira'ah that might be problematic, maybe from the stance of narration, for him is still strong enough to mention, because for him it's worth more than a rationalistic process. As the same is for poetry, he cites thousands of verses in his texts, and also in Al-Bahr al-Muhit. And most interestingly is that he had published or tried to publish or tried to write grammars on languages other than Arabic. So there's one on Turkic, which Kipchak Turkic, which has survived. He has one on Persian, which hasn't survived. And by the way, I mean, when he's writing the Turkic grammar, this one he learned from one of his teachers, but this is one that would not previously have the grammar written. So he's doing what we could kind of imagine as, field work to write this down. The same with Coptic. He does a dialect of Coptic that is the non-canonical one, is Bashmuric or Fayyumic Coptic. And then a language which we think might be Ethiopic, but it might actually be a Bantu language. And these that he would have documented, because the typical way to do Hajj in those times was to go down the Nile and then across the desert and across the Red Sea. So he had access to speakers either in his travels or within Cairo. Now he mentions these other languages in his texts. I'll come back to it now in the next slide. Another issue connecting to the idea of data is that of hadith. And as you may know, hadith for most scholars of grammar is unacceptable as linguistic data. And Abu Hayyan has a long passage where he mentions why, and it can be summarized thus, is that essentially that we cannot be certain of the text of the hadith, because the hadith narrators allowed hadith narration to be by meaning, and we know this, and also because the hadith literature also has multiple wordings for the same event. So therefore we cannot independently know any hadith by its specific linguistic utterance, as opposed to the Quran, which there was, if you like, a obsession with the actual philological text, and there wasn't that same obsession with the hadith. And also, as compared to poetry, in which usually it was done by a protege of the poet, and the protege is someone who's trained in that. Whereas you don't find, there is no particular class of, if you like, hadith narrators in the very early stages of hadith narration. Even though there are people who narrate a lot of hadith, there's no independent class. In the same way you could say that these people were qurra, and these people were shu'ara. You couldn't say these early, people were, ahl al-hadith in the sense of, them transmitting hadith. He also...
Tarek, sorry to interrupt, but if you could just wrap up in the next couple of minutes, that would be great.
Sure. This is, I think, the last slide. So thanks for that. One of his big issues that he talks a lot about is the fact that we cannot give underlying reasons for something that is conventional within the language. So in his Manhaj al-Salik, which is his commentary on the Alfiya of Ibn Malik, he says that the phonetic shape of pronouns is something that is conventional in the language. There is no kind of hidden secret in whether there's a dhamma or a fatha or a kasra at the bottom. And he says, I've learnt many other languages, including, Ethiopic uses the word Habashi, so we're not sure exactly what he means. And other languages, and he cites them, and he says, look, these are all different, these are different pronouns in different languages, and there's no intrinsic link between the utterance and the meaning. Also, he is very conservative in making linguistic rules, and he'll only do so if there's a certain amount of data. When there's not, he usually criticizes the other grammarians about this, and it's kind of in contradistinction to the Persian tradition, in which you'll find kind of a free association or free kind of reason, a use of reason to kind of bring about an answer. So in summary, having presented the three, I say that, Ibn Hazm, as a Zahiri, but not a grammarian, didn't show a big influence of Zahirism on grammar. Ibn Mada, was not a grammarian, and his work was rejected by the majority of grammarians. But Abu Hayyan is one of the most influential grammarians, and his kind of synthesis of Zahirism and Mu'tazilism is something that remains with us today. And thank you very much.